Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, welcome to Nesta Talks to Leslie Kern. My name is Kathy Notstein, and I'm head of Future Cities at Nesta Challenges, so I'll be hosting our conversation today. If you're not familiar with us, Nesta is a global innovation foundation that brings bold ideas to life to change the world for good. Nesta Talks To is our series of informal conversations with today's most interesting thinkers, focused on the big topics that will define our future. In this age of overabundance of information, it's hard to know how can we make sense of the world around us, how can we play a part in shaping the future. To guide us towards some of these answers, and of course even more questions, we're talking to today's leading thinkers, community builders, artists, social entrepreneurs, who are working on understanding the world around us and what our future might look like. Every month, we're holding these conversations to focus on an urgent topic, from mental well-being and equality to the climate crisis and the future of humanity. So today, we are very lucky to be speaking with Leslie Kern. Leslie is the author of 2 books on gender and cities, including today's topic, Feminist City. I have it here, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World, published by Verso. She holds a PhD in Women's Studies from York University and is currently an Associate Professor of Geography and Environment and Director of Women's Studies and Gender Studies at Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick. So coming in here from Canada. The conversation we're going to have here today will center around the points that she makes in her latest book, which, as we say, Feminist City. Through history, personal experience, and popular culture, Leslie exposes what is hidden in plain sight, the social inequalities built into our cities, homes, and neighborhoods. It is time to dismantle what we take for granted about cities and to ask how we can build more just, sustainable, and women-friendly cities together. Welcome, Leslie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me to be part of these important conversations.
Great. Well, we're really, really glad to have you here. So I've got some questions that I'm going to kick the conversation off with, but then we're really happy to hear. I know that our audience is going to have lots of questions too, so please do pop those into the question box, and we'll have plenty of time to get to the conversation more broadly. But to kick things off, I just want to say honestly how much I really love this book. It really resonated with me. Myself being a woman, being a person who loves cities, being an urban planner, being a mother, there were so many themes that you touched on. One thing I thought was really interesting was this concept of feminist geography. You have this great quote about men being the primary decision makers in cities, making choices on everything from urban economic policy to housing design, to school placement, to when snow gets removed, so many of these things. And often those decisions are made without taking into account the needs or considerations of how this might affect women. So could you talk a little bit about this concept of feminist geography?
Sure. So feminist geography is sort of a subfield of study under human geography, and one that I had never heard of until I was in graduate school myself. But it's a way of looking at the environments around us, including built environments like the city, and understanding how ideas about gender are not just kind of played out like on a stage. You know, the city is a stage and we're just acting out our gender values of society, but that a lot of norms and ideals around how people behave, about power, and so on are actually structured into the built environment as well. And our cities are kind of, you know, again, they're not just a neutral container, they are also kind of active participants in shaping society, how we interrelate to one another, how our economic systems work, how our interpersonal relations are shaped. So for me, feminist geography has been a great way of adding a literally kind of a third dimension to understanding how gendered power works in space. And as you point out, a specific example of that is thinking about who builds cities, right? Who historically has designed cities and whose needs have they been most kind of targeted to cater to?
Great. Yeah, I really like the idea of kind of the city as a living place too, and how the interaction with the city, can change and can shape, and it gives us that sense of opportunity. But of course, we're here living in kind of the physical infrastructure that's been handed down. Kind of there's this heritage to interface with. So that's really interesting. Kind of building on that, really, I did want to talk about the fiscal design of cities, maybe because, like I said, I sort of come from an urban planning background, and I'm kind of interested in how our physical environment influences the opportunities we have or don't have, and kind of the way we navigate the places that we live in, but also the lives that we're able to lead. So one thing that struck me is, anyone who's navigated the city with a disability of some kind, or with a pram, with small children, with any kind of needs outside of kind of the default able-bodied white cis man, of how you can see that those do become struggles. So I'd be interested to hear from you, what has been kind of the historical situation, and how you might think, how you've seen some of that based on your research starting to change, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. What you point out is that in many ways, the design of cities, particularly our kind of transportation networks and the way that we've zoned cities to have, residential areas, particularly like suburban areas, kind of dislocated from places of work. And we've set up our transportation networks, including our cars and public transit, to kind of get someone to and from home and work at particular sorts of times, and assuming that they are essentially unencumbered and that they're making a very linear journey. And this has worked pretty well for the typical male commuter, as you say, but for other people, it has not worked as well. And the suburbs are a really great example of how the built environment kind of shaped particular economic and social imperatives and continues to. So in the post-war periods, when there was a very literal push to get women back in the home out of their, Rosie the Riveter type jobs, and to create full employment for returning veterans, and to create places for them to start families and so on, the suburbs were very much both a spatial and kind of ideological solution to what had become sort of changing gender norms. And the suburbs were like, literally, no, here is a house for you to full-time take care of, and this will be your role, and it will be isolated from the city and employment. There will be no public transit. You may not have access to the family car. And so it really shaped that kind of stay-at-home mother relationship, male breadwinner relationship. And today people, the suburbs haven't gone away, even though for most families that kind of single breadwinner model is not the norm, or not the norm for a long period of time. And people continue to have to kind of struggle against it. It's really difficult to juggle the multiple responsibilities of home, paid work, and all those other aspects of life, while trying to do so in an environment that wasn't ever really set up for you to do that. So some of that is changing in different ways. Some of it has been sparked by, gentrification. So families saying, actually, this doesn't work. We're going to move into the city. But of course, that creates other sorts of problems for lower income families who find the inner city less affordable and are now being kind of pushed into the suburbs. So we have some, interesting patterns happening, but increasingly there's recognition that we can't simply rely on a sort of notion of a linear journey to work of one breadwinner, and that we need to create more robust public transportation networks, and to have the suburbs interconnected also as places of employment to the city.
And it feels impossible in these times to talk about transport patterns and commuting and the home, given the world we're living in right now. So I'd be really interested to hear your take on how this new era of remote working, having to homeschool, kind of not by choice, but suddenly a lot of people are thrust into this situation. What you think some of the impacts of this will be, how you've seen it changing women's relationship to the city already. And I'd be interested to hear what you think how it might change cities moving forward.
Yeah, it's such an interesting moment with, I think, both some potential for opportunity and change in a good way, and also some moments where we might be seeing things kind of regressing in a way. So yes, obviously for those people who, first of all, are sort of, they have a level of privilege where they can work from home. So there's already a divide there between people who have been deemed, essential workers, or whose jobs were lost in the pandemic because work from home was not an option. So there is that sort of already a divide to think about. But for those families and women who are working from home, but who also have children or other care responsibilities, we're seeing what many people have always known, which is that it's not really sustainable to try to do those two things at once. And yet there has broadly been this sort of background idea that somehow this will all take care of itself. And I think a little bit of an old school assumption that there is somebody available to do this work. And I think what we've already seen is that, from what I've been reading and think posts and blogs and articles and even some early research, is that women are taking on more of the load of the homeschooling, entertaining the kids, the extra housework that comes from having a whole family at home 24 hours a day, and that men have not been taking an equal share of that load, which is kind of not surprising, just given that is already kind of the trend. So moving forward, one of the challenges will be for that work from home situation. If it continues for a long time, how is that care work going to be redistributed? Or are women going to see many of the gains that they've made in the workplace kind of retrenched, scaled back for them? Are women going to have the opportunities for promotion, for advancement, for putting themselves forward in the workplace if they're kind of sequestered at home? Women are already often overlooked. And if you're literally not physically there with the people who make the decisions, I think that could have a detrimental effect. And then on the other side, we of course have the sort of armies of women who do the low paid, undervalued care work that is literally keeping us alive, keeping us fed, keeping our spaces clean. And those people struggle to make ends meet. They typically don't have the privilege of living as close to their place of employment as others. They're putting themselves at risk in crowded public transportation systems, and they are not typically well paid for the kind of work that they do. So in a hopeful way, one could say, okay, well, maybe we'll start to really value that work, and that work will be paid well, and those workers' needs will be taken care of. On the other hand, I for so long, society has really relied on that being so much and underpaid work that it would really be I think quite a radical economic transformation if we were to say, oh, actually, this is the most important work that we do as a society and that is done in our cities.
It's really interesting. Yeah, it really has turned things on its head, really, as far as how we view essential work and where and who are performing those jobs, and what that looks like moving forward. I think there's quite a bit of interest in active transportation, which is great. I'm a huge supporter of active transportation. And there's kind of, some optimism that this will reshape cities for the better. But then those questions about, well, who is active transportation options available to, who is it not available to, where you already live in your city, and what kind of changes will need to come into place in order to expand your transport options. It's not quite as simple as everyone just hopping on a bicycle. I think there's probably a lot more that needs to be kind of built into it, and there's a lot more considerations that need to be put into place. So yeah, lots to think about. Let's see. Well, maybe jumping on that, since I was interested in what you were saying about the history of post-World War II and the demise of suburbs, and how the the kind of ideology around that and the impacts that it had on working women's lives or non-working post-World War II, and how that shaped economic prospects over the past 70 odd years. One thing I've felt, being a mother of small kids in a city, is that there's challenges, like we're talking about the physical design, but then there's also the opportunities. And I sometimes wonder about, my alter life, if I was raising kids in the suburbs, how different would my day-to-day be, and what would be the advantages and disadvantages? You talk about this a little bit in the book, about what opportunities or what a city can afford, it can offer really, you know? So I wonder if you could sort of play out some of the pros and cons, or just kind of what you've seen.
Yeah, and I think historically, women have always been attracted to city life, even thinking back to the Industrial Revolution. Women came to the city sometimes by choice, sometimes not, but the city offered a place of maybe some freedom from typical, very constrained gender roles in small towns and rural areas. Cities offered places of employment. Cities offered some excitement, some difference in your life. And I think that remains true, but in a very material way, cities have also offered ways in which that kind of juggling of like a double and triple day of paid and unpaid work, of community work, of all of the other things that women do to kind of keep their families, their communities, and their societies moving forward. Cities have enabled that because of their kind of spatial organization. So when people were first observing gentrification in the 60s in places like North London, for example, one of the theories put forward was that gentrification, the sort of movement of middle-class families back into urban areas, was a kind of spatial solution for this problem of having to juggle paid and unpaid work. That if you were physically closer to the place of employment, to shops, to schools, to healthcare, to other social services, to public transportation, that managing all of that would become a lot easier than trying to manage across that spatial isolation of the suburban environment. So a lot of people argue that gentrification was in part driven by women and just by changing household norms around work. And I think that that was probably true. As I mentioned before, kind of the problem there is kind of for whom was that available? And now that we're well into the 20th century, we've seen gentrification go from a kind of, neighborhood by neighborhood, small scale reality to sort of corporate-led, huge developments, these kinds of things that are quite exclusionary and arguably haven't really done that much to advance gender equality. But at the same time, I think we do recognize that cities still offer those opportunities. The question is, who are they available to, and how can we expand that sort of pool of availability, so it's not just sort of the most privileged people who get to enjoy that interconnectivity of urban life and the pleasures of urban life as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The idea of city as opportunity, I know that's a theme in your book, and that's a theme, of course. I mean, that's why so many of us love cities, because that's where you can access, education and greater job opportunities and cultural opportunities and things like that. But then there's also the value of kind of the social network that can spring up from being in cities, and physically just getting a chance to know your neighbors, or having services more readily available to you, and networks of other people that you can draw on. So I think that's really, really important to kind of unpack. Another thing that, well, you have this idea of like taking up space in a city, which I think is great, like the freedom to take up space, and touching on, other recent global events, Black Lives Matter, and using cities as a place to protest and to exercise activism. You have a whole chapter on this, and it's obviously really timely. That's what a lot of people, came out of lockdown to suddenly find themselves wanting to express their anger with the system, and using the city as a space to do that. So could you sort of talk about that, and talk about this power, and how women can take advantage of that?
Yes, thank you. So yeah, public space is hugely important aspect of cities, and one of the things that of course makes cities so special and historically has made cities effective places for social movements of all kinds, right? That visibility, that ability to kind of speak directly to power, those in power in cities, whether you're protesting outside of Wall Street, or in Trafalgar Square, or outside of the Parliament buildings. You're speaking to power, and there's a visibility that comes with that. And so public space has always been important as a part of democracy, right? As a part of how democracy functions. Different people come together put their points of view out there. We clash sometimes, but it's also that space of encounter. And people have also noted that for different groups of people, simply being in public space is a political act, right? If you have been shut out from public space, as women historically were from many public spaces, simply being in public space was an act of claiming your broader political and legal rights. For people with disabilities, the physical inaccessibility of public space meant that for, decades or hundreds of years, disabled people were put in institutions and out of sight, out of mind. And the movement in the 60s for disability rights was very much, no, we deserve access to public space, and that's a political act. And now with Black Lives Matter, although obviously this is, continuation of decades and decades of struggle, but it's similarly saying we have a right to be safe in public space. We have a right not to be over-policed simply for existing in public space. And we have a right to move through public space and not see former slave owners glorified all around us, those sorts of things. So public space is so key for that. And I think going forward between the protests and the pandemic, which is also asking us to rethink how we utilize public space in cities, as we're sort of recognizing like these might be the spaces available to us, right? If indoor spaces are dangerous, if public spaces are going to be the kind of spaces that we can safely use as societies, we need to start rethinking the fact that we have often, many cities, we've increasingly privatized public space. So it's kind of corporate owned, corporate surveilled, and so on. We've created kind of top-down, rules about what can go on in public space that limit the kinds of activities that can happen there and who can gather there. And with now thinking, okay, how are we going to go forward and make use of public space in creative ways, in ways that drive equity, in ways that bring us safely together? It's definitely an opportunity to say, okay, well, maybe we don't need as much car space, for example, or maybe we don't need as many parking lots, or maybe we can repurpose this green space in different sorts of ways. So it's definitely, an important moment for rethinking public space in cities from all sorts of angles.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I think that's really exciting. And I think, it goes back to how this is kind of a time of opportunity, of being able to reclaim our city and use this public realm for different things than has been seen as like acceptable in the past, perhaps. Sort of building on that, but then bring it up maybe even a little bit more down to the personal level, since you talk about fear in cities and you talk about kind of the individual experience of being in city. I love you have the section where you say something about the dangers of whether it's a woman or a Black or person of color, kind of feeling like they shouldn't be out in a city doing their own thing, and the risk that's inherent to that. And then the sense that you sort of get away with it, like women, I know I'm definitely guilty of this in the past, of being like, oh, I shouldn't have been out late by myself, but I got home safely, like I got away with it or something. And you sort of turn that on its head, don't you? Could you talk a little bit about how we should reverse that paradigm of thinking?
Sure. Yeah. So it's so interesting that for many women, we've kind of very much internalized all of those rules about our safety, and a lot of those rules have to do with place. They're kind of a geography of like rape culture, or of a mental map of where I'm supposed to be and not supposed to be, because we know that we could be blamed for something that happens to us. And of course, we've just been socialized through pretty much our whole lives into a fear of strangers, the dark alley, the nighttime, all of these sorts of things. And so we very much take it on as a kind of level of personal responsibility that we implicitly accept, that we have to engage in these different sorts of behaviors around our safety. And what this results in is this kind of weird manifestation of like, oh yeah, I was so lucky. Like, you're so lucky to not be attacked walking. Like, why is that lucky, right? But that's how we've internalized it. So yeah, I try to flip that on its head a little bit and say, well, what if that's not just luck, but what if that's, the fact that as people who have to be extremely attuned to our environments and who's around them, and have that low level vigilance or high level vigilance at times, that we actually might be very smart at decision making, that we might actually intuitively know a lot of times when something is safe or not safe to do. which again is not to, go so far as to say, well, then women, can be blamed for making bad decisions. Of course not. But women every day, despite all of the dangers, despite all of the socialization into fear, we get up every day in our cities and we go to the subways and we walk past those dark alleys and we meet friends at night, or we go to our night shift, we take public transportation, we endure harassment, we, struggle to get our kids onto the bus, all these sorts of things. So we know that, fear is not overwhelming and it's not destroying women's lives, that we actually push past it every day, and that women are quite brave for kind of going about our daily lives in this context where we're taught that we should be so fearful. And of course, I argue in the book that being taught that we should be so fearful is also just part of the way in which society tries to kind of control women's opportunities, and to tell us that actually maybe it's not that safe for you to be, a public figure. It's not that safe for you to be living, your fullest, most, fully realized life.
Really, really helpful. It makes you so mad, but it's empowering. And it makes you so mad when you realize how much of this we've internalized and just take for granted that. But I should go to questions, because we do have a lot of questions coming in, and I want to make sure that we get to address those. And I guess people can see that there's a way that you can vote up questions. So I'm just going to go from the top and take the ones that have gotten votes that people are keen to hear your responses to. So this first one is, in the book that you don't necessarily have an example of a complete solution of a well-balanced place, but do you have any precedents that are starting to work towards this goal?
Thank you. Great question. So people keep asking me, so is there a feminist city? I'm like, I wish there, it would be Atlantis. We'd all be, hopping on a boat and going there, I think, if it did exist. But yes, what I try to do in the book a little bit is say, well, within any city, we could look to examples of ways that women and other marginalized communities are always working towards creating different sorts of spaces and opportunities. And even on a large scale, like Black Lives Matter movements, we could see as an example of that. But in terms of things like infrastructure, I think that there are examples in different places where different sorts of innovations are happening. So some of those might be around public transportation. So both in terms of thinking about where public transit networks go, which have historically not served women that well in terms of the kind of care work that we do in addition to our paid work. So expanding transportation networks beyond the sort of, suburbs to central business district corridors, coming up with innovative ways for women to report or fight back against harassment on public transit, which is kind of this global problem that women everywhere report feeling unsafe on public transportation. And so everything from, apps that women can have on their phones to initiatives in different urban public transportation systems to combat harassment are things that are happening. In the housing realm, movements around things like co-housing, which is a kind of communal living where, family units kind of still have their own living quarters, but there's shared common spaces and kitchens and green space and things like that, as a movement towards sharing those care responsibilities. And I was just looking this up recently, and there's, little examples of this in cities all over the place. It's just not super well known. So the opportunities are there, definitely.
Okay, good. Okay, cool. Yeah. I'd love to look into that and find out, expanding, especially this seems like such a juncture, going back again to the pandemic. It's such an opportunity to change things on its head of how we've always thought of how our houses need to be set up and our relationship to offices and retail. So great.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Next question. Let's see. Sarah says, great book. I have a question on how smart working in the city, if it becomes a permanent solution, it could allow many people to rethink where they want to live, liberating them from long commutes and overpriced cities. However, our jobs are frequently the way through which we shape not only our lives, but we also create connections with the city. It's the way we socialize, etc. are also often the only reason we leave our houses. Good point. So how could we regain and reshape the relationship with the city without turning it into a consumption-driven relationship, going out to shop, going to restaurants? Fairly optimistic about a world in which less commuting, etc. But then how to fight loneliness? So, great question.
Yeah, that is a great question and really points to some of these major societal challenges because we've had the capability to do work from home and distance work for several decades now, right? And even in the, in the 80s, people were talking about telecommuting and surmising that this would be kind of the death of the city, that people would, everyone would telecommute and we would all just, kind of disperse and live in whatever area we wanted to live in as long as there was basically a phone line and now, internet connectivity. But that didn't happen. Right? Like some work from home has always happened, but even with the technological capabilities, we still had office places and there was still a kind of sense that you didn't want to totally explode that system, even though it has problems like commuting built into it, because there was also benefit, both a benefit in terms of the work environment, but also I think that human social benefit that, especially as adults, our workplaces that may be where our friends are, that is our social time. And as I mentioned, that kind of, being together is also important for kind of feeling connected to your career and your work and all those sorts of things. So going forward, if we are either kind of forced or have more opportunities to work from home, I do think that will be a challenge. What do cities mean to us? Are they just spaces to go and, drink or party or have those sorts of events? I mean, on the one hand, those cultural aspects of cities can't be underestimated, the ways in which public art or, cultural activities and so on are an important part of what we do, how we experience cities, the kind of political action that happens in cities. People are, I think, going to want to be connected to that, because I think that kind of dispersal, if we were to see the population disperse, that would have huge political implications based on, the fact that our political systems, democracies, are set up on representation of in geographic areas, right? So if you think about if we completely change that, it would kind of upend the way that we have seen our democracies work, maybe in some cases for the better, but maybe not as well. So I wish I had a clear answer to the question, but I think that you are pointing to something really important, which is that cities are more than just places of work, and how are we going to stay connected to them moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think it is, there's not one single answer to it, but maybe I'm being optimistic, but I don't think cities are dead. But I think our relationship to them and our uses of them are radically going to change. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's see the next question. Well, this is timely. The question is, what would be the number one thing that we could change to reclaim space in our cities?
Number one, well, so hard to choose a number one. I would probably, as I mentioned earlier, want to argue against trends of privatization of both public space and also kind of the financialization of so much of urban space. So everything from our real estate to our, to our homes, to our parks and so on are increasingly private owned, or they're financialized in some way. So they can't just exist on their own as spaces for the public good, but they are seen as, spaces where some kind of like profit has to be extracted from that. And that is, driving a very exclusionary trend in cities where only the most elite can afford to live in central cities. People are being, pushed out into areas that are not as well serviced in a whole variety of ways, and are finding it, extremely difficult to make ends meet or to, achieve the sort of, the North American and maybe the British dream of home ownership anywhere near the cities where they want to live and work. So I think if we can, encourage movement back towards more public provision of urban spaces and urban goods and services, I think that would be an important move forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a couple questions here about examples. They're sort of phrased a little bit differently, but the main question here is what are your favorite examples of how cities have changed for the better and are starting to address some of these issues?
So let me point to one example that is kind of really small, but actually I think quite significant for how cities can make changes. So one of those is around public bathrooms.
Mm.
So what, again, in this like age of privatization, you know, cities used to take some responsibility for providing that as a public service, like an actually publicly accessible bathroom. But now cities have kind of backed away from that, and our public bathrooms are the bathrooms inside a Starbucks, right, or a shopping center, and those are expected to provide that service to the public. But we know that's also quite exclusionary in terms of who can access those spaces. And bathrooms, you know, they point to the fact that often city planning doesn't really think about the bodies that use city space, right? That we are bodies moving through urban environments that have embodied needs for food and rest and shade and warmth and shelter, and to use the bathroom for all sorts of things, right? Not just to relieve ourselves, but bathrooms are that little private space where sometimes, you know, care activities need to happen with other people, and all sorts of things can come of it. So some cities, so there's an example in Portland that they invented this Portland loo, which is this, you know, sort of self-contained public toilet that's its own sort of unit, and they've popped up all over the city with the recognition that this benefits all kinds of people. You know, people have said, oh, well, we can't have public toilets because it attracts homeless people, as if that, you know, is a good reason. But public toilets are a benefit to elderly people, people with disabilities, women caring for children, or any parents caring for children, and just, you know, anybody with a disability that needs to use the bathroom more often than regularly. And so it seems like such a small and silly thing to talk about, but actually for many people, lack of bathroom access inhibits their ability to participate in public life. They don't go into the city. So for me, I think, you know, a feminist vision of the city is one that recognizes that we have bodies and that it's okay that your body needs things. And the toilet is one example of that. In other places, you know, one of the things that I think is so interesting is also a move towards, you know, green technologies and green energy and things in cities, because some of these green energy innovations are actually, I think, can have the potential to work in terms of social justice as well. So in cities in Germany, for example, where there's been a big uptake of green energy, it's not just about putting solar panels everywhere, but it's also about redesigning the home so that you have some communal living, because the single family home is quite an energy inefficient way for us all to live. We all have our own washing machine and dryer. We all have our own stove. We're all, you know, on the grid taking all of this energy, whereas sharing some of those spaces and services is good for the environment. So I also think there's, you know, a lot of interesting potential in that crossover between sustainability, green initiatives, and social justice and feminist initiatives as well.
Great, thanks. And then there was a follow-up question related to examples. Somebody was asking specifically about transport and examples of cities that have done, who have made some really great strides in, you mentioned before, the challenges that women face globally in using public transport.
So it's a little bit kind of piecemeal from what I can gather from some of the research that I've done. So some cities have focused on, well, one thing would be increasing the physical accessibility of the public transportation system. So making sure that you have buses that, you know, kneel low to the ground, or that your rapid transit trains are flush with the curb, and that you can get into the subway system via elevators. So those are really important physical improvements that happen slowly, but they are happening in many places. Cities like Seattle have tried to build in an equity lens into their transit planning to ensure that different sorts of communities that have been underserved by public transit are getting the most benefit out of new public transit initiatives. So often we see these like really nice like luxury trains going from really wealthy suburbs into downtown cores and the neighborhoods that are where people, you know, use the bus and wait for bus on bus on bus to get where they need to go. They never get the benefit of those things. So taking that equity lens and seeing, you know, who would benefit the most. is one way that things are improving. Cities in India like Delhi, for example, in recognition of the dangers and the violence that women have faced on public transportation there, are attempting some of these initiatives around different sorts of safety apps that women can use, and sort of broad public education around women's right to use public transportation. So there's little sorts of bits and pieces. Some cities have, tried things like women-only buses or women-only subway cars. I think Tokyo, Mexico City, places like this have had these initiatives, and well, they sort of solve an kind of immediate problem. They don't necessarily ask anybody to like change their behavior, but it's one way that in the short term anyway, cities have tried to grapple with some of those safety concerns.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's encouraging, and it does give women a sense of feeling then that they can meet their immediate needs and get on the transport system and not be harassed and get to where they need to go. But yeah, you're right about then the larger systemic issues that are still underlying that need to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, lots of other questions here. Let's see, this one here, this is UK specific, says, so you may or may not be completely up on the context around it, but we'll see how we go. The UK government has published its new vision for cycling and walking today. It sounds great, but one, it isn't backed by enough funding. And two, it will face hostility at a local level from councillors and NIMBY types. So how do we address the bike lash at a local level? And how do we challenge the car is king mentality that still exists in the UK? And I would say, I believe still exists in Canada and the United States as well.
Oh yeah, it's off the charts here in terms of the car mentality. At least you usually drive small cars in the UK. We not only do we want cars, but we want the biggest possible vehicle that one can possibly own over here. So yes, this is a huge issue, both for environmentally and equity-wise as well, I think. Yeah, you're right. There's so much NIMBYism around, well, we have to have cars come in. People won't come to shop or eat or do their stuff if they can't drive a car. To me, and maybe this just belies my own sort of political commitments, I think it's like, you have to build it and they will come kind of thing. Like there has to be that strong political leadership to go against what is going to be popular in the moment. And then once you have the infrastructure, because part of it is we do these crappy little, especially here in Canada, these crappy little bike lanes that are not really safe, that cars can still pull in and out of. They're really narrow. They're on, they're potholed. They're not safe and comfortable to ride in. And so not that many people use them. And then, oh, well, the project failed, right? So to do it on a large scale, it's kind of like, let's, widen, these lanes. Let's actually take away some car space and force people to change their behavior, and to then actually see what the benefits are. Because I think partly it's this kind of underfunded, weak, half sort of initiatives that then kind of die on the ground that are part of the problem. Whereas if you look to a European city or many European cities, you're like, oh, well, somehow they managed to do it. They managed to have an equal amount of cycling, pedestrian, and car space, and somehow their economies seem to keep functioning. So I think partly it is pushing through that resistance, building it well, and then allowing it to flourish.
Yeah. And I think building it well is often a challenge too, that some cities have done better than others, and then there's the knock-on effects from that. But yeah, absolutely a great, encouraging response. Here's a great question, which Grace says, apart from your amazing book, do you have any other key readings / podcasts, other media for feminist architecture, feminist cities, etc.? Would love to hear.
Thanks. Oh, great question. I mean, I spend a lot of time in my academic world, so a lot of the work and the reading that I do is kind of along, within sort of academic journals and so on. one of the places that I look for interesting ideas of things that are happening are, websites like City Lab, for example, that often publish like great, updates on different sorts of projects that are happening all over the world. Curbed is another good one that I'll look to for finding, okay, what's like actually happening in the world right now. I don't know if I know of any great, well, podcasts, one really good one is called 99% Invisible. And it's a podcast about the built environment. And it's not specifically feminist, but they do address all sorts of ways in which physical design of spaces is inequitable in different ways, or the kinds of ideology behind space. So they talk about disability in different episodes. They talk about public toilets. They talk about unpleasant design, like deliberately hostile architecture and urban design that's meant to exclude people. So yeah, 99% Invisible, I think, is a really great one to turn to. They have lots of kind of short, really clear episodes. I use them in my teaching as well.
Great, good. Definitely I'll look into that. And this kind of brings to mind to me that maybe there's an opportunity here. Maybe we should start a podcast.
Yeah.
Feminist Geography.
Sure, add that to my
calling out some places. Do a Twitter feed, a shaming examples of infrastructure that doesn't work for women. We'll look into that. But the next question is, this touches on stuff that's in your book too about intersectionality. The question is, how do you transform intersectional feminism into urban action to make the city for all? And that's a great question.
Yes, no easy feat there. But one of the things that I try to drive home in the book is that we don't want to just swap out this sort of white, able-bodied, cis, middle-class male subject for its female version with all of the, well, most of the same sort of privileges, and say, well, what would make this woman worker, happier, make her life easier? Because in fact, that's still quite a privileged position that's going to exclude probably the majority of city dwellers. So I like to think about, well, what if we started urban planning from the perspective of a sex worker? What would make that person feel safe? What would support their life and livelihood? What if we start from the position of a disabled person? What if we start from the perspective of a recent immigrant to the city? What if we start from the position of, a woman of color, a single mother? So if we can imagine those perspectives, again, not as competing, but as multiple voices that could tell us something about what cities need, then I think we would be getting to that intersectional place where we're recognizing that what works for one group of people might actually make things worse for another group. And we need to really be careful of, advocating for certain sorts of interventions that might feel nice or look nice or make some people comfortable, but end up making things much worse for others. And so starting from a variety of different places is, I think, one way of getting there. And of course, that involves both, acts of meaningful community consultation, but also really opening up these professions that have been very white dominated, like planning and architecture, super male dominated, and having much more diverse representation in those professions and at city government levels as well.
Great, yeah, thanks. I really like that idea of turning it on its head and starting. I was definitely not taught that in planning school, and I wish I had been taught. So I think it's a really interesting exercise to go about that way. I hope that becomes more common to approach it in that way. Be so much more logical. Let's see, we only have a few minutes left, and we do have quite a few questions, so I'll get right into the next one. It's about city mayors. So that's kind of a relatively newer thing here in the UK than in North America, but this concept of, this question to me seems to be about power. Do you find that city mayors are essential to give focus to the change? I guess it's about power and leadership. Are city mayors essential to give focus to the change? If not, do you have examples of how change can come about? Where does it start?
Great question. I think city mayors historically can be very powerful figures for advocating for change. They really can set the tone of a vision for the city, I think about, in Toronto, some of the, we've had a whole range of kind of mayoral personalities, and their personalities have played a huge role in kind of what has happened in cities. And I think we could say the same about London, for example. And we know that, it's at kind of the mayoral level, the mayoral leadership level, that some huge changes, for example, happened in London around like the tax for driving cars into the city center. That was massively unpopular when it was proposed, right? And it was like, this will fail, nobody will go along with it. And it was sort of like, well, we're just going to do it anyways, right? So that commitment to really pushing things through and to having that vision, I think there is a lot of power there. But of course, the limiting factors, the ways in which mayors, I think, are increasingly, beholden to corporate power because of the lack of funding that comes from higher levels of government. So cities have had to become businesses, right? They've had to become these entrepreneurial entities that are bringing in their own money from corporate investment. And then of course that is going to shape things in a particular way. So cities are also a little bit, have their hands tied a little bit by the increasing pullback from, here, like state or provincial governments or federal governments funding cities and sort of saying to cities, no, you're on your own, like kind of, make your own way. And that, shifts politics in a different direction too.
Yeah, definitely. Even more so, I mean, in North America, cities do have more power and they have more funding and they have more control, but they're still very much beholden to state or provincial or federal decisions. And then here in the UK, there's still so much spending power and things like that that are completely out of cities' hands, unfortunately. But there's this great quote from Bruce Katz, formerly of the Brookings Institution, who I always think of, who always says, the cavalry is not coming. Like cities need to, and more so, cities have been taking control where national and federal governments fail to act, gridlocked by partisan politics and things like that. Is that the innovation is happening in cities, that's what we would say. And the more that we can do to empower that innovation and advance that forward thinking, the better. But yeah, the lack of funding and lack of power is definitely a concern. This question has been in here for quite a while and it's got the most votes. We've got so many questions coming up through it. But Wasim says, as a married man, a city that can accommodate my wife and child is in my interest, as both a human and as being part of a family. Do you think the benefits to men's own families, wives, children were simply overlooked by men when they were designing cities?
Yeah, I think there's kind of an overlooking that definitely happens when you just don't have that multiplicity of voices at the table to say, hey, this works differently if you are a caregiver, this works differently if you are juggling, 2 part-time jobs or something. So there's an overlooking, and I don't like to be a conspiracy theorist that imagines, planners sort of sitting there going, we're really going to screw women over here. But I also think on a much deeper level, and again, it might be so deep that it's unconscious to most of us, is that our economies, our urban economies, our global economies are entirely dependent on somebody doing a whole bunch of unpaid work, right? Work that we don't count in GDP, work that we don't pay for, and work that we don't recognize or value. And if that shifts, then everything shifts. And so there's a huge, again, like it's not conscious, but a huge need to kind of maintain that status quo, because if we really shifted that, like, what would we do if we suddenly, like think back to these movements for like wages for housework? What if that came to fruition? Like, how would that radically shift everything that we know about society? So I think there is great kind of implicit pressure to keep certain norms in society unquestioned and kind of invisible. So for example, in the space of the home, where we kind of are not going to interfere as a society. So even though, yes, I think you're absolutely right, there is a great benefit to everybody of expanding and redistributing care, that, the way that we've set up our economies to function has really relied on it being quite unequal. So it would be a huge shift to change it.
I want to call people's attention to, in the questions, you can see some people have commented with great examples of other things to read, other sources of great information. So do have a look in those. I think everyone can see all these. So I want to dig into some of these too, because there's some great ideas. So take a look and see if you see that. This book, Invisible Women, by Caroline Criado Perez, I can say is great. Definitely recommend that. Okay, I think we only have time for probably one or two more questions. This next one comes in from Catherine. She wants to know, how can we build cities of the future which are inclusive for all? What does the process and infrastructure need to develop? And she says inclusive in terms of also considering women, BAME, and people with disability.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that some of the changes that I suggest under the banner of a feminist city, I think are also changes that have broader equity and environmental sustainability possibilities behind them as well. So, you know, very simply thinking about physical accessibility of urban spaces is something that is not just benefit for disabled people, but for elderly people, for caregivers, for anyone who just has to carry a load of shopping with them, right? So physical accessibility is not a niche issue. The questions around privatization, I think that privatization has, you know, affected low-income people, racial minority groups, more so than other groups, because it's led to further, you know, entrenching of exclusions of those people because they are, you know, over police. They're policed by the police and they're policed by private security and corporations. So we have to fight against that. Things like housing affordability, you know, on a very, again, basic yet would be quite a transformative level. Affordability is a huge issue. It's a huge issue for women. It is very much a gendered issue, but it's also a racialized issue, in addition to being an income issue. So if we had adequate affordable housing plans, rent freezes, anti-gentrification initiatives, those would go a huge way to resolving some of these inequalities. And we could also think about public transportation. We've talked a lot about that today, but it is a huge determinant, I think, of equity. So if we could have free public transportation, if we could have expanded networks of public transportation, then that is going to benefit people kind of from the ground up in ways that could be quite transformative.
Great. Thank you so much, Leslie, for your time. I think that we're almost at time here. I think so we should probably wrap up. So unfortunately, we can't get to all the questions. But thanks to everybody out there who's tuned in and sent in these great questions and contributed to the discussion. I think there's so much more to dig into. But yeah, unfortunately, we're out of time. But thank you, Leslie, and I do recommend the book. I found it to be really informative and really inspiring, and also, like I said, made me angry at times too.
That's good.
Anger we can act on. So as I mentioned, just a few wrap-up words that we do these events once a month. Do sign up for Nesta's events newsletter for future events. Coming up, we have Reb Eleanor Johnson from the Nobel Prize winning International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons on how to build a more secure future. We also have Mackenzie Wark on the thinkers of the 21st century. We're adding new events all the time, so do sign up to the events newsletter on Nesta's website. And with that, I just want to thank Leslie one more time. So
thank you so much. It was a great opportunity. I'm so thankful for all the questions and all of that engagement. And I just mentioned in the chat that the book is available from verso.com or 40% off right now. So that's a great deal if you are interested in picking it up. But thank you so much for all of those great questions, and Kathy for hosting today.
Excellent, great. Well, thanks. Well, have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon or morning, depending where you are.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Okay, bye.
Bye.